Hey friends, welcome to Shigaraki. So today we are gonna see, what if Deku became the heir of a fallen demon lord? So before we start, check out my Patreon page for 18+ exclusive mature content. We will now proceed to the video. Get back here, Deku. A young voice rang out. Its owner was running through the streets of the city. A young blonde boy with crimson eyes. He couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. He seemed rather irate as he, along with a couple of other children, were chasing after another boy. This one had a mop of dark green hair, and he looked positively frightened as he was running away from his trio of pursuers. Kachan. Why do you have to be so mean? Heroes shouldn't be bullying others, the young green boy was thinking, although this was at the back of his mind as he was fleeing from the young Bakugo and company. Their pursuit took them into the downtown of the city, as the children had finally cornered the green-haired child at the corner of an alleyway, facing a door. Alright Deku, I think it's time I show you why you're a useless, quirkless nobody. The young boy's voice was filled with an unfiltered malice, his words slowly bringing the fear within Izuku to the surface. As Blonde and his 2 accomplices were closing in on the green-haired child, the door behind him creaked open, and almost immediately, the trio of aggressors stopped dead in their tracks, frozen by a presence that could only be described as demonic. Oi, what's going on here? A deep and rather rough voice rang out as a man stepped out of the doorway. He was tanned and possessed a mop of mostly gray hair, with a shock of almost minty green on top of his head. He also wore a darker green yukata with a red sash to act as a belt tied around his waist, with a trio of swords strapped to it. The man's most menacing feature, though, had to be his eyes. He seemed to possess no iris, just a black pupil, but one of his eyes is closed, a scar running through it. The look on his face appeared bored almost, looking at this child's confrontation, but it was quick to change to annoyance as he took in the situation. He looked to Bakugo and his 2 friends and grabbed the hilt of the bottommost sword, its hilt black with a red interweave. "You 3, out," he said, his voice never wavering. But the children could tell this was not a man to be trifled with, and with a grunt, Bakugo turned tail and ran. His 2 friends quickly followed suit. Izuku was left alone with this man, who then knelt to meet the young boy at eye level, his eyes once again looking plain and apparently disinterested. "So, why were those kids chasing you?" the man asked as he stared down the kid, waiting for his answer. Izuku sniffled a bit, rubbing away some of the tears from his eyes as he looked up at the man who had saved him. "I was trying to stop them from bullying another kid, but I couldn't do anything since I don't have a quirk," was all he had to say. "No quirk, huh?" the graying man said as he looked Izuku over. "What a shame. With determination like that, you could have become a hero," he said and stood up, turning around to go back inside. Izuku seemed to be on the verge of tears again, once again hearing his dream being dragged through the dirt. But Izuku turned his head up and saw the mysterious man looking at him. "If you learned how to fight, maybe you could make up for the fact you're quirkless," he said as the man looked at Izuku, and then he reached to his waist and pulled forth the top blade, its sheath a beautiful white, like an ivory tusk. The sword itself was a Japanese straight sword. A silvery gleam shined from its edge as Zoro held it lengthwise for the younger boy to marvel at, which Izuku did. The boy's young, wide eyes marveled at the blade before him. "You think I could become a hero with this?" Izuku asked the man, truthfully. Nobody before had believed his dream. Not Bakugo, not his school, not even his mother. "I'll be honest with you," the man said as he resheathed his sword. "If you go down the path I did, it will be hell on earth. You must make up for your weakness by becoming stronger. You will have to train day and night, tirelessly if you want to make up the ground between you and those around you, born with their strength." His gaze became serious, almost savage as he looked down at this boy with a ferocious visage. "Are you willing to do this? To go through hell and back to achieve your dream?" he asked. The young boy faltered a bit at those words, but he clenched his fist and smiled up to the man. "Yes, if it means I can become a hero, I'll do whatever it takes," he yelled, and the man's angry scowl broke into a small grin. "Good, I wouldn't want to train someone with no resolve," the graying man said as he turned around. "Come here every day, and I'll train you," and call me Rorinoa, kid," he said, and shut the door in Izuku's face, quite abruptly. But young Izuku could only smile with hope as he rushed back home, to prepare for the next day. Midoriya House. 1 week later, Inko Midoriya was a worried mother. Every day Izuku would come home, he would look like death warmed over, he was almost always covered in bruises, but he never came home sad. His smile was genuine, filled with determination and joy. It wasn't the usual smile he wore, one that was hollow, and attempting to appease her. "Honey, where do you keep going?" she asked young Izuku, looking down at her son. Izuku, however, could only smile wider. "I'm training to become a hero, Mom," he said excitedly, looking up at his mother. His mom seemed bewildered by this statement. But Izuku, you don't have a quirk, how are you going to?" asked Inko as she was interrupted by her son. "With this," the young boy said, and he pulled out 1, 2, 3. Shinai were taken out of there. He placed one in his mouth and took up an attempt to look threatening, but it ended up looking adorable. "He said, his voice muffled with the bakken in his mouth. Inko looked down at Izuku, looking nervous at her son. "Could you take me to wherever it is you train then? I'd like to talk with your sensei," she said, and Izuku nodded happily. "I'll show you tomorrow, Mama. Rorinoa sensei likes to go out at night," Izuku said, as he rushed off to his room to change out of his school clothes. Inko, on the other hand, seemed nervous, going out to meet this Rorinoa. She didn't entirely trust her son's judgment. Having seen him come home with bruises even before he started training, she wanted to confront this man herself. Rorinoa Dojo, 1430. Inko Midoriya and her son had arrived at the dojo, and Inko was far from impressed at the sight she saw. It was extremely simplistic, with a couple mats on the floor and a circle drawn with chalk, most likely used for sparring. What did draw her attention was a man who stood off to the side, and was lifting weights, more specifically, a barbell that was easily double his size on each end of the metallic rod, and he was lifting it with one arm. This sight alone sent a small shiver up her spine. "Finally came to check it out, huh?" Inko was snapped out of her stupor at being addressed, and a loud metallic thunk echoed through the room as the weights crashed to the ground, making small fractures in the cement. Rorinoa was walking to the pair, and almost immediately the young Izuku stood at attention, stance straight and strong. "Welcome to my dojo, Midoriya-san," he said as politely as his rough, deep voice would allow before looking down to his pupil. "And you, I suggest you get started with your weights, go to 50 today," he instructed, and almost immediately Izuku nodded. "Yes, sensei," the young child said excitedly, but with as much seriousness as he could muster. He ran to the weight rack across the room as he struggled to lift the discs from the rack and sliding them onto a much smaller rod than his mentor's. Once the weights were loaded, Izuku grasped it with both his hands and groaned as he was attempting to lift it. Inko was watching with worried eyes as her son was attempting to lift something almost as heavy as he was, and saw the strain on his face. As she was about to help, a bamboo Shinai was placed in her path, held by the green-haired man. "Don't interrupt him. He won't get any stronger otherwise," were Rorinoa's words to Inko as he never took his eyes off of Izuku. The same said for her mother. "Why are you doing this? He can't become a hero without a quirk, he could be hurt, or worse," was Inko's response. The look of fear in her eyes was apparent, but it soon became surprise as her son made progress, sweat covering his brow as the young boy cleared the weight off of the ground and held it proudly above his head, and then he dropped it onto the floor, panting as he then approached the rod so he could repeat the whole process. "Why do you think I'm doing this? For the fun of it?" the master asked as he watched his pupil doing the exercises, his face never wavering. The kid lives in a world where everyone wants to beat him down for being weak, unable to manifest a power, he said, and Inko looked on, watching her son slowly easing into his weight exercise and lifting the comparatively heavy weights, struggling each time, breathing ragged with each rise and drop of the weight, but the look in his eyes was unlike any other, eyes full of fire, passion, utter determination and obsession on the task at hand. He'd only ever held a look like that when watching the All Might video. So if he lives in a world where the strong rule, Izuku has two options. Learn to live with being weak, or become strong, were Zoro's words to Inko, and it was then that Roronoa turned to the mother of his student. Do you think Izuku is the kind of kid who wants to be weak? Would be happy with merely being on the sidelines? He asked, and pointed to Izuku. Besides, what kind of parent would try and kill their child's dream? He asked simply. If you want to pull him out, go ahead. It's none of my business. But if he doesn't learn under me, he'll try to find some other way to become a hero. You won't be able to stop him. Inko let the words sink in as she watched her son's workout, and had to mull on their discussion. Izuku can keep training under you, Inko said as she looked to the graying man. She seemed uneasy about the process, but the look on Izuku's face made her rethink it. Don't worry, Midoriya-san. I'll take care of the kid, he said. Izuku had begun his path, the path to becoming the strongest hero. Clack. The sound of wood hitting wood echoed throughout the dojo as two combatants were clashing with each other, mirroring each other's moves as their sparring session quickly became twin twisters of blades, crashing their bakken together in a swordsman's rhythm. Come on, kid. I barely felt that last one, Roronoa yelled out, his speech perfect despite the bakken shoved into his mouth. His opponent was his own student, Izuku Midoriya. The young boy had changed drastically over the decade of his life. For the most part, he still had a youthful body, but now his frame was rippling with muscle from the nightmarish training Zoro put him through. His wild mess of dark green hair descended to sit below the ear level, while he kept it in a messy bun as to keep his hair out of the way during combat. Unlike his teacher, who wore a green yukata, Izuku wore a navy blue yukata with a bright green sash acting as his belt. His robe-like pants were a lighter shade of blue. He too wielded 3 bakken, clutching the third between his teeth. Izuku held a grin despite the aches and pains that came from blunt trauma. Yes, sensei, was Izuku's main response as he pulled back. The two once again mirrored each other and they leapt at one another from across the room, and did a quick spin. 108-pound cannon. The two uttered and their flips generated so much force that they sent powerful, long-range wind pressures that burst like cannonballs, and their cannons collided mid-air, creating a crack and a blast almost like a hand grenade. Roronoa then stood straight, and removed the bakken from his mouth, and he held a grin as he looked to his student, who went to rest by drinking a cup of water. Good job, kid. Roronoa said calmly as he walked to Izuku. The cannon you sent out was a little more than 108 pounds, which is great, he said as he then pat his disciple on the head. I have to say, I expected you to quit before the first year, he said bluntly, which Izuku deflated at. But you have been a phenomenal student, one who I would be willing to call my successor, he said, to which the young boy's eyes widened. Roronoa chuckled as he took out his prized sword, the white-sheathed blade, Wado Ichimonji. He tapped the tip of its sheath against each of Izuku's shoulders. Congratulations, kid. I think you're to become your own man. Your own hero, he said, and then presented his student his own blade, Wado Ichimonji. What swordsman doesn't have at least one sword, he said as he then presented Izuku a pair of other katanas. The elder green-haired man grinned down at Izuku. But you're only getting Wado. My 2 other swords are a bit too heavy for you, he said, a small pause in his voice. Izuku couldn't have been happier though with just these 3 blades though, even if 2 were standard katana. When he grasped the handle of Wado, it sent a tingle up his arm, that spread throughout his body, as if the sword was alive. His face was wavering, on the verge of tears before he burst out. Thank you, sensei, he cried out as he pulled Zoro into a hug, at which his teacher was none too pleased with. Hey, don't cry on my robes, kid, he yelled as he had to pry off the kid from his body. He then fixed Izuku with a mean glare. All right, kid, get out of here. You got class today, right? He said, and when Izuku looked out the dojo's window, the sun was just rising. Right. The young boy yelled out as he rushed behind a paper screen to change into his school uniform. He stepped out, still with his hair in the ponytail. Bye, sensei, he said as he was about to step out of the door, but was once again stopped by his master. "Wait, kid," he said as he fished through his pocket. "I forgot to give you this," he said, and pulled out a green bandana, looking almost as dark as Izuku's own hair. The young swordsman looked confused at the sight of it. "A bandana?" Izuku asked, grasping the cloth. When he did, he could feel it, the power that came with the cloth. An overwhelming sense of dread passed through him in an instant. "Yeah, a bandana," Roronoa said. His gaze could almost tell what was going through his mind. "Whenever I used to fight, it helped focus my brain in on the battle. Maybe it will do the same for you, kid," was the man's last words before he shoved Izuku through the door and out into the world. Bewildered, he stood up and left, walking towards his middle school. Oradera Middle School. All right, settle down, class," the middle school teacher told his class. "Today is the last day you all will be middle schoolers, so please take some serious considerations into which high school you'll be attending," the curly-haired man said, before throwing his papers in the air. "But it's obvious, you all want to be heroes, right?" he yelled out, and the class erupted in raucous glee as almost everyone in the class was flexing their quirk. "Don't lump me in with these side characters, teach. I'm going to attend UA." The voice belonged to Katsuki Bakugo. The blonde kid from 10 years ago had aged into an equally cocky and powerful teen, leaning back in his chair. "Besides, it's not like any of you could compare. I have some of the top marks in this school." "UA? That's the most elite school in Japan. He thinks he can get in there? I heard the entrance exam was almost impossible." Did he call us side characters? All the children in the classroom began to murmur amongst themselves at Katsuki's declaration, wondering if he'd hold true to his word. "Wasn't Midoriya going to attend UA as well?" one of the students said. At this, the blonde's eyes shot wide open as he stared back at Izuku, who was towards the back, his face buried in his hero notebook, almost oblivious to the rest of the class. "Deku!" the blonde yelled as he slammed his hands into the desk of the green-hair kid, who was not too fazed by the assault on his place in the class. "What do you think you're doing? Are you trying to ruin my origin story?" The blonde seemed absolutely pissed, and his ire grew exponentially when Izuku just turned the page over to look at his most recent entry on Mount Lady. Izuku's half-lidded gaze at his book was a good signal that the blonde was being ignored. "Huh? Did you say something, Bakugo?" he asked. The blonde in question seemed to lose it almost immediately as he raised his hand and was about to cave in Izuku's head, along with the rest of his body. "Katsuki! That's enough!" the teacher yelled, and the blonde stopped his assault, looked absolutely pissed. Ever since Izuku had begun his training, Izuku and Katsuki's interactions had been like this. Izuku would always feign ignorance, or truly mean it whenever the blonde threw insults at him, and even in fights Izuku would take any hits given to him, but never once had he cried. He just laid there and then would stand up to leave. "You're lucky this time, Deku. The teacher won't be there to save you next time," he said, and as turned to go and sit back down, he saw the 3 sheaths leaned against Izuku's desk. He hadn't seen those before. After class, Izuku had stood up and clasped his 3 swords to his belts as he heaved a duffel bag over his shoulder and was going to leave when Bakugo had come once again to face Izuku. "Seriously, Deku. Why are you even trying? You don't even have a quirk to get in. You think some nerdy journal and some toys are gonna get you a spot?" he said with a sadistic grin, and he darted his hand forwards to grasp one of his swords. However, his hand was caught and gripped hard by Izuku's. Katsuki would be forced to crumple to a knee as his hand was being placed in a vice grip, and Izuku looked down at him with a dark glare that seemed out of place on Izuku's face, like he was possessed. "Don't touch the swords," were Izuku's only words as he pushed Bakugo's hand away. "Don't try to do it again, Kachan," Izuku said as he stared down at Bakugo. The blonde was scowling, almost growling as he stood up and stared Deku in the eyes. "Fucking Deki, just get out of my way," he said and shoved past the green-haired kid. Izuku sighed as he then gathered his stuff up again. "You never change, Katsuki," he said as he walked away from the scene, choosing to go back home. Izuku was walking through a less than desirable section of the Tatooine district, something that his teacher told him would aid in sharpening his senses. As he was walking though, he lifted his head up and sent a slash behind him, which was caught by a wall of goo. Wow, what a strong-looking body, and a sword. Don't see those every day. The living wall of goo said as it lurched forwards. It enveloped a quickly panicking Izuku, who was attempting to slash off the slime man, but it was constantly growing back, and as he was being constricted, he could feel his swings being sapped of their strength. Just give it up, kid. You won't have to worry much longer. Fear not, kid. I am here. A mighty voice bellowed as the sludge that was threatening to consume Izuku was blasted off of him by a tremendous force. The young swordsman fell to the ground, kneeling as he was trying to cough up any slime that was left in his mouth, and he looked up to see All Might, the #1 pro hero, standing there, striking his classic pose with arms at his sides. All Might, he said, looking up at him before attempting to stand up, using Wado as a support. Thank you, All Might, he called out as All Might turned to leave. Worry not, kid. This villain will be charged accordingly. He shouldn't be bothering anybody anymore, All Might said before crouching. Now, I really need to be off, so goodbye, kid, he yelled as he rocketed into the air, but he felt a weight on his leg, and he looked down to see the boy clutched to his leg. Wait. I need to ask you some questions, Izuku yelled as they were flying through the air, and All Might was forced to land. Izuku put some space between them when they landed though. Come on, kid. I can't be wasting time with you. I need to get this guy back to the police before. Were all the words the pro hero thought before he was consumed in a puff of smoke, and he was changed, physically at least. Gone was the muscular symbol of peace. All that remained was a thin, twig-like man, and one who was coughing up blood. Izuku had to stand back, but was horrified at what he saw. All Might, what happened? He asked, and the older fellow wiped the blood from his face. It's the reason why I was trying to get away, he said, and he lifted his shirt to show the grievous scar he had been left. I was fighting a villain years ago, and he dealt me this wound before I could defeat him, he said, letting his shirt cover the mark once again. But ever since, the time I could keep using my power without experiencing great pain has been diminishing. By now, I've only got a few hours left every day where I can use my quirk, he said, and Izuku could only look. Do you think I could become a hero, even if I don't have a quirk, All Might? He asked, looking at his idol with a neutral, but hopeful look. All Might looked at Izuku, and let out a small sigh. In all honesty, kid, you'd be safer just joining the cops. If you want to be a hero, you need a quirk to be a hero. Otherwise you'd just be a liability. I'm sorry, kid, he said as he turned around and he went to the door of the roof to leave. I wish you luck on whichever path you choose, he said before leaving, and Izuku was left alone and he clenched his fist, shaking as he then let go of his fist, and took a deep breath to calm himself. You don't need a quirk, Izuku, you just need your determination, he told himself as he then left to follow All Might down the stairs, but was not surprised he didn't see him. He walked alone on the streets, clutching his bags and his swords. Not long after, he saw the smoke, and he ran to find the slime, the villain, the same one that had been attacking him earlier, now attached to Bakugo, and using his quirk to blow up the whole city block. Come on, heroes. Afraid to strike me and my meat puppet? The sludge villain exclaimed with an arrogant tone as the heroes truly were at a standstill. Why aren't the heroes doing anything? None of them can get close without hurting the kid. They're waiting for a more suited hero. They need to do something soon. That kid could die any minute. There. That was the trigger for Izuku. He rummaged through his pocket and found it, the bandana. He looked at it a little uneasily, and remembered his teacher said. The bandana is honed in on the fight, become a warrior. Izuku repeated to him as he tied it around his head. It shadowed over his eyes, leaving them cloaked in darkness if anybody looked at him. Meanwhile All Might was also present, and he was equally useless as the other heroes, and he was clenching an emaciated fist. Shit, I'm out of time for the day, I couldn't stop that slop if I wanted to. Hiro thought in despair as he watched the scene unfold. However, he felt someone brush against him as he saw a blur rush past the crowd, the heroes, to attack the villain. All Might's eyes widened when he saw Izuku, dressed in his school outfit still with a bandana. That look, where have I seen it before? All Might thought as he watched young Midoriya rushing the villain. Santoryu, the sludge villain, turned his head up when he heard those words be uttered, only to be met with Izuku. The look in his eyes could only be described as murderous, and the edges of his mouth pulled into a snarl, boring into the villain as he suddenly stopped moving, and that was all Izuku needed. 108-pound cannon, yelled Izuku as he flung forth a burst of wind from his 3 blades, generating it with a mid-air spin. That essentially ripped Katsuki out of the sludge villain, and sending him skidding into a wall nearby, and while there was a crash sounded, Katsuki seemed fine, albeit knocked unconscious. My puppet. The villain yelled as Izuku landed, the same look on his face. I guess you're stronger than I thought. Maybe you'll make a better puppet. Come here. The sludge villain yelled as Izuku then put his 2 hand blades close to his body and vertical, waiting for his enemy to come close. Santoryu, Izuku said, and he was still waiting, muscles tensed and storing energy, waiting for the villain to reach him. Tatsumaki. He yelled, and he this time did a single spin on the ground, but it created a twisted around him that sucked in the sludge villain, then quite messily spread the gunk into small, relatively harmless pieces across the alleyway, and with that single attack, Izuku was left standing, blades wide apart and looking rather intimidating to anybody looking at him from the front or the back. All Might in particular was shocked, as his eyes were wide, a memory flooding his mind as he was thinking about another fight, long ago. Hosu District. Years ago All Might had arrived late to the scene of the battle. The Yakuza had been united as a single force, one that was threatening to take down the hero agency in the area. Civilians had long since gone, and the pro-hero was greeted to the sight of not a huge, epic battle, but a slaughter on the streets. The bodies of dozens, maybe even a few hundred Yakuza, both quirked and quirkless, were strewn about, with the pro-heroes nursing equally grievous injuries as there was one man still standing, surrounded by a dark purple aura surrounded him, a man wielding 9 blades, and the man that stood before him was the leader of the Yakuza, a man said to have been almost invincible with a quirk that allowed him to become a huge beast, Kaido of the Hosu district. But this man, the man they'd been tracking for months, the man who threatened to become a criminal kingpin, lay on the ground with his chest almost torn open by blades. You. Who are you? It's obvious you're not a hero, but why do this? Why destroy the Yakuza? All Might yelled as he walked forwards to the mysterious, but extremely dangerous figure. The figure turned to All Might, and the pro was immediately blasted by a wave of killing intent, and saw the 6 arms he had dissolved to simply be 1, and the same went for his 3 heads. It's easy, the figure said as he removed a sword from his mouth. Because they challenged me. Present All Might stirred from his recollection as he stared at young Izuku, who was being reprimanded by the heroes. You were being reckless, kid, yelled Kamui Woods at the green-haired swordsman. You could have killed that kid with that reckless move you pulled, Death Arms had then yelled. But Izuku's bandana had been tied around his wrist, and he seemed calm, smiling in spite all the heroes attempting to tell him he was being a fool. When the police asked him a few questions, he answered them with half-truths to leave out All Might's true form, and he was allowed to leave. Izuku meanwhile was smiling as he walked alone, back to his home. He had satisfied his own conviction. He believed he could be a hero. Hey kid. Izuku, right? Izuku turned around to see the emaciated All Might standing before him. What kind of hero would I be if I didn't put my words into practice? He said as he looked at Izuku, and then assumed his muscular form. Because, you can become a hero. He yelled as he gave Izuku a thumbs up, to which Izuku returned it, a single tear coming from his eyes as he was smiling an earnest, childlike smile. In fact, how would you like to become my successor? I refuse. All Might said when he heard those words. His brain had pretty much misfired when he heard those words. I said I don't wish to be your successor, he said, looking at the tall blonde hero. All Might was silent. He kept the smile on his face for a second. Then he dispersed into his emaciated form, coughing up blood. He was surprised that the boy refused. "Why then?" he asked. "I'm not upset about it, believe me. I'm just surprised that anybody would refuse," All Might said as he then rubbed the back of his head. Izuku sighed, and looked to Yagi. "Because I made a promise to myself and my teacher. I know that I can get into UA without a quirk," he announced. Izuku stood strong, looking to All Might with eyes lit with a fiery passion. All Might's emaciated face looked neutral for a while as they held a stare with one another. "Kid," Toshinori said as he then assumed his heroic form, his body growing with muscle and strength, his smile returning. "You never cease to amaze me," he yelled proudly, and then gave a bow to Izuku. "I wish you luck, young Midoriya. The UA entrance exam is difficult. I hope you get through. Maybe when we meet again, you will reconsider the offer. Take care." With that, All Might leapt through the air to return to his own home, to rest. Meanwhile, Izuku watched his old role model sail through the air, and smiled. He couldn't regret this decision. Besides, he had a great deal of training to get done. Dagoba Beach. The next day Izuku's training took place at Dagoba Beach in the very beginning of the days, just as the sun was rising. He stood on the soft sand and looked out at all the garbage that littered the place. He'd been reading the papers a while back to keep track of hero stuff, but found an article on Dagoba Beach's filthy state. He decided cleaning it would fill the time nicely as part of his training. "All right. Day 1. Start sorting out the trash," he told himself as he was a little out of scope on the sheer amount of scrap. Hills of scrap metal, tires, even fridges and wrecked car parts were all strewn about the grounds of the beach. Sighing, he stripped down to just the pants he wore under his training robes and found the first object, a large, restaurant-sized fridge, double-doored. He knelt down and dug his fingers underneath, flexing his muscles as he was attempting to lift it off of the ground, and his straining was apparent as veins all across his arms were popping and he eventually cleared it over his head. He smiled in triumph as he then proceeded to find a nice spot to set it down and start a new pile. Impressive. A new voice talking to him out of nowhere, of course, made him drop it halfway to his destination and almost crush his foot. Bewildered, he looked back to see who it was. The figure before him was a young girl, no older than him, with inky black hair that cascaded down to below her shoulders like a waterfall. She had an athletic figure made apparent by only wearing a sports bra and yoga pants, as well as wearing sneaker. However, her eyes were what drew the most attention. A bright yellow color like the eyes of a wildcat on the prowl, and he the prey. He flinched slightly at seeing this girl here. "Who might you be?" Izuku asked as he approached the girl, and the two seemed to lock eyes, both looks seemingly passive, but both were letting loose a great deal of their own spirit, causing some of the sand to blow away. "Me? You can call me Heart," she said, and then looked at the beach. "A sorry state this beach is in." "Are you cleaning it up?" she asked the green-haired swordsman. To this, Izuku nodded. "Yeah, I'm training up for the UA entrance exam," he said as he then knelt to pick up the fridge again. He wheezed a bit at the awkward hold of the fridge, but he made it to his desired area. All the while, Heart was watching Izuku with a calculative gaze. "Then I suppose I'll see you in 10 months then, friend," the girl said, her voice soft and elegant like one of noble birth. But Izuku could tell from voice and look alone that this girl was one to watch out for, especially if she was to be a competitor in the entrance exam as well. Izuku turned back to the pile, and saw the girl was gone, and he could only smile, as he didn't even see a footprint in the sand. "Heart, Izuku thought as he worked on picking up the next piece of garbage. "Maybe I'll see you in 10 months like you said." Dagoba Beach. 10 months later the beach was spotless, the sand free of a single scrap of metal or discarded rubber thanks to the efforts of Izuku. He stood there triumphantly as he stared at a nearby cliff face, holding one of his swords. His final test to see if he was ready to the entrance exam. He swung his sword through the air at the cliffside, and seconds later, a massive gash became visible in the rock. Izuku smiled once more at the progress he made, holding up his plain katana into the air, and gave a victorious yell, which earned him more than a couple of weird looks. UA entrance. Didn't expect them to so big, Izuku said as he walked through the gates of the illustrious UA Academy. He dressed simply in his light green training robes and training pants, and blue sash. He saw Bakugo as he was walking to the testing area, and the Wo held a hard glance with one another, at least until Izuku tripped over his own 2 feet. He would have fallen to the floor, if not for him suddenly floating. He looked to see a girl had saved him from falling on his face, her hair done in a bob cut with her bangs framing her rounded face nicely, and her constant blush making her look cute. "Hey. Sorry for using my quirk on you, but it's bad luck to trip on your first day here, right?" she said as she let go of Izuku, and allowed him to drop a little more gracefully. "My name is Ochako Uraraka, and you?" she asked. Izuku smiled as stood up, and bowed graciously to his peer. "My name is Izuku Midoriya. It's a pleasure to meet you," he said, and the two gave each other a smile before heading into the examination room. UA examination room. "Everyone say HEEYYY, a cacophonous voice boomed as the final seconds ticked away on the written portion on the exam. Some of the teens there sighed, others groaned as they had to set their pencils down. The voice, however, that was heard above all others was the blonde hero, Present Mike. He looked down at all the students from his podium, and was largely unfazed when nobody responded to his call to arms. "All right, young listeners. It's time you guys got the lowdown on your physical exam," he yelled with as much excitement as he had before. He then directed everyone to look at the screen, and then the screen lit up with the map of the fake district they'd be fighting in, along with 3 silhouettes. "This is a points-style exam, and there will be 3 false enemies you will be fighting. All of them each have a ranking of 1 to 3, with their points being equal to their rank," he said, and almost immediately a student stood and pointed his hand to Present Mike. "Excuse me," he announced, drawing everyone's attention to him. The pamphlet had said there would be 4 enemy types. How could this be the best hero academy if there's such blatant errors in the information given out? He yelled and then looked over to Izuku. "And you, if you insist on looking so tired, you should have gotten more sleep. You will not be in such a condition to fight properly. Otherwise," the glasses-wearing student yelled at the green-haired swordsman. He had been looking half asleep in his test-taking area, but it was mainly out of boredom, not exhaustion. He had since learned to take in information more passively, and doesn't mutter nearly as much, while still being of sharp mind. It probably came from the fact his mouth was usually full. Izuku merely ignored the male examinee and then stared to Present Mike, who then looked to Tenya. "You are correct in your thinking, young listener. The 4th kind of villain is supposed to be an obstacle and is worth 0 points. It's almost unbeatable, and not worth engaging. You're better off just running," Present Mike said and then pointed to the right. "The physical begins in 20 minutes. You all need to get changed and ready," the vocal hero yelled, and the whole student group got up, each heading to their respective changing areas, to ready themselves for battle. Mock City B. Izuku stood among the crowd of people. He was wearing his blue training robes with the green sash, and amongst this group of quirked teens, looked unassuming. He saw Uraraka stretching and preparing herself, and was about to walk over, if not for the blue-haired man from before stopping him halfway, aggressively chopping his hand at her. "Halt! Are you trying to impede her progress?" the guy from earlier asked, giving Izuku an angry look, one the young boy flinched from. Upon closer inspection, Izuku could see the engines built into the guy's young swordsman had been startled, and rubbed the back of his head, embarrassed. "No sir, I just wanted to say thanks for earlier," Izuku said as he then turned away from Iida, and soon enough the test began. The only one to take initiative when the whistle blew was Izuku, fighting instinct kicking in as he leapt forwards, cleaving the head from a 1-pointer. "That's 1 point," Izuku thought to himself. He needed all his focus today, and abstained from the bandana. His eyes sharp and bright as usual. As a 2-pointer snuck up behind him, he twirled midair to slash apart that villain, but his defeat was stolen by a laser beam, coming from a posh-looking blonde boy, who merely gave Izuku a thumbs up. Examination room. "It seems we have quite the interesting batch this year." A singular, higher-pitched voice said. The voice belonged to a plushie of all things, or rather a small ursine-like creature as he looked at the screens displaying all the exam areas. All of these young individuals show great promise in quirk potential, he said. One of the other heroes present, a rather tired-looking man, with thick brown hair, was looking at the students. One of the screens displayed Bakugo sitting at the top of a small mountain made of villain scrap, and another of a red-haired man with incredibly sharp teeth physically punching through one of the robots. His gaze was passive until it reached the screen displaying a whirl of blades that was slicing through multiple villains. What about that kid? The thick-haired man asked, and then pulled out a small profile on a clipboard. Says here that kid is quirkless, he said to the others present. A couple of the younger heroes scoffed at this, but the older present, their eyes became intensely focused on that screen. The plushie from before was sipping some tea as he looked on at Izuku's blade work. So you've finally groomed a successor, huh? The plushie thought to himself as he had other examinees to observe. Examination Hall B. As time passed in the exam, Izuku was quickly racking up points relatively quickly, his swordplay netting him a ferocity and speed others couldn't match. He did however leave alone any villains that were already in combat with other examinees, not wanting to rob them of their chance. Izuku felt good about his chances, like he could. Thump! A large burst of air was sent through the street that Izuku stood on. He had to sink a blade into the ground to not be blown away. When he looked up, it was the 0-point villain, a building tall colossus that towered over the examinees. At the mere sight of it, most of the other examinees ran away in terror or sensibility, as there was no benefit to fighting the thing. Izuku looked up at it, some fear rose in his chest, but his feet refused to move. Why can't I move? I can't fight this thing. I need to. His thoughts were racing at an alarming speed as he couldn't find himself able to move. That was until he saw the girl from before, Uraraka, pinned under some rubble. He rushed over, the massive 0-point villain trundling at a slow but intimidating rate. He looked at the girl's position, seeming that half of her body was pinned under some large chunks of building. Can't you use your quirk to make it float away? Izuku said as was trying to lift it off, but even he couldn't make it budge. I can't. I have to touch it in order to do that, and I don't have the leverage to do that. You should get out of here. That thing will crush you, Uraraka said, tears streaming from her eyes. Izuku looked at Uraraka and saw the sadness there. It moved him, and he looked to the villain that threatened to destroy the two of them. Don't worry about me. I think I can beat it, Izuku said as he stood up and held his bandana in his hand. I will need your help. When I say go, I need you to touch me, understand? Izuku kindly asked Uraraka. The round girl could only nod as she watched Izuku take a breath and tie the bandana around his head, and his eyes almost changed from the bright-eyed boy from before to the darkened eyes of a man, a warrior bent on victory. Izuku paced a couple feet away before going into a sprint, his foot planted on the rubble Uraraka was on, his feet right next to her. Uraraka, now! The green-haired boy yelled and Uraraka slapped his ankle, and Izuku propelled himself through the air like a human cannonball. He placed his swords at an angle with one another as he began to spin them like a propeller. I know you said I wasn't ready for this technique yet, sensei. But if I want to win, if I want to save this girl, I need to make the effort, Izuku thought to himself as he neared his target. Santoryu, secret technique, Izuku said, speeding up the rotation of his blades, and his movements were fluid as he then brought the swords forwards in a savage slash. The 0-pointer stopped in its tracks, before its body fell apart, a huge hole blasted through its arm and upper body, and having also been sliced apart. 3,000 worlds. Izuku roared out in triumph as he had blasted through the machine. His victory was short-lived, as he saw he was still going. Ah! Uraraka! He yelled out. Uraraka had to touch her fingers together, and then his body sunk like an anchor and he did a roll on top of a building to break some of his momentum, but he ended up tumbling about. Time's up! A voice echoed through the stadium, and Izuku looked up, breathing ragged with a smile on his face. Even if he didn't pass. He gave it a strong effort. His whole body was sore from all the activity he did, and he was one of the last to leave the stadium. 2 weeks later, Midoriya household. "It's here," Inko Midoriya yelled, running to her son. She delivered to him the letter detailing his results. Izuku took the letter, and calmly opened it, ready for whatever would come forth. A small medallion hit the table, and then projected a message. At first the screen was emptied, only for a man who could only be described as an insomniac rose from the bottom of the screen. He wore a white scarf and the most neutral look on his face. "You passed the test. Congratulations," he said simply. Izuku expected more for some reason, but was relieved to hear he passed. "Due to your exemplary performance, a hero, you've been gifted a spot in Class 1A. Don't be late," the man said before cutting out. Izuku was ecstatic, and he could only scream out in joy as he had been accepted. Izuku stood outside of the classroom, room 1A. Izuku wore the standard male uniform for a UA student, and he chose to wear his hair in a slightly more organized top knot, although it seemed naturally messy due to the curly nature of his hair. On his right side were his 3 swords, his 2 standard katana being contained within drab-looking black sheaths, while Wado sat in its pristine white one. In addition, he wore his green bandana tied around his right wrist. Building up his courage, he finally stepped through the door to be greeted with the first shouting match of the school year, and class hadn't even begun. The blue-haired guy from his portion of the exam was yelling at Bakugo quite fervently, while repeatedly chopping his hand through the air in Bakugo's direction, while the blonde in question was resting his feet upon the desk he sat at. "How dare you put your feet on these desks? Don't you care about the sacredness of these grounds? This is where heroes are shaped," Tenya yelled at Bakugo, who grunted in response as he waved off the fervent man. "Whatever, side character," Bakugo responded, standing up to meet Tenya's unannounced challenge. He stared the glasses-wearing nerd student with eyes of fire and brimstone, and anybody who looked on at Bakugo may even call him a villain. But Izuku tried to stay silent, not wanting the attention. Unfortunately, Iida noticed him almost immediately and approached. "I'm happy to see that you passed the exam," he told Izuku, who seemed a little tired and flinched from being at the point-blank range of Tenya's yelling. "My name is Tenya Iida. It will be a pleasure to be learning alongside you." But as Tenya was talking to him, he felt the piercing eyes of his old bully attempting to pierce through him. He turned from Iida, walked to Bakugo, and the two exchanged heated glances. Bakugo's, a fiery passion and disdain for his rival, while Izuku's gaze was calm, placid, but it masked the equal amounts of rage and aggression Bakugo held. Their staring contest was interrupted by a pair of pink arms wrapping around their necks. They belonged to an entirely pale pink girl, with black sclera, little yellow horns on her head and yellow irises. "Come on, guys. Let's not fight. It's only the first day of school and you guys already can't get along?" she asked, looking at the two. The feelings of intimidation only increased from the two of them, the two boys almost being surrounded by energy before their attention was pulled by this yellow thing rising from the ground. Most of those present thought it was a caterpillar until it turned to show a human face to the class, the same face as the same teacher that delivered Izuku's acceptance speech over the hologram. The yellow turned out to be a sleeping bag that was unzipped from within and now showed the man was human. "You two, quit staring at each other. We don't have time to be wasting on petty squabbling. Now all of you, change into your gym uniforms and meet me on the field," their instructor said before leaving them all to change. UA training field. The students were all lined up out on a sandy field, each of them wearing a primarily blue uniform featuring an arch on the top and bottom of the shirt, meaning to symbolize the letters UA. Once again, Izuku carried with him his blades, which all of his peers were curious to look at. One of the students, Uraraka, approached Izuku. "Hey, it's you. Thanks for helping me in the exam," she said happily, looking at Izuku. The green-haired teen could only blush a bit, and rub the back of his head. "It's not a problem, Uraraka. I would have done it for anybody. We are all training for hero work, after all," he said, and then their teacher gestured to them. "Enough talk, it's time to begin," he said, and he looked to Izuku. "We're going to be doing a physical examination to test your prowess. Any questions? The instructor asked, when Uraraka raised her hand. Why didn't we go to the opening ceremony? Or orientation? It's a first day of school, she asked aloud, and the man merely sighed. Such activities are a waste of time, if you were to ask me. Time spent on introductions like those of a school should be used for training, which is what we'll be doing here. In addition, you will be allowed to use your quirk to maximize your scores. The teacher said as he gestured to Izuku. Midoriya. You can start, he said, and tossed the ball to the green-haired man, who let it fall to the ground. It says here your highest middle school score was 50 meters, correct? The tired-looking man asked. Izuku nodded, and unsheathed the gleaming blade of Wado Ichimonji. It's released. Surprised most of those present, none but a few had ever seen a sword in real life. Because you're quirkless, the principal had to sign off on you bringing weapons to school. Don't make us regret this decision, the thick-haired man said as he stepped away to allow Izuku the full room he required. However, the whole class was looking on in awe. Quirkless? One of the male students exclaimed. He seemed to have an antenna with yellow and black hair. This was Denki Kaminari. I didn't even know you were allowed to take the test if you don't have a quirk, an invisible girl said. Quirkless have always been allowed the opportunity to try out, however most don't bother to try, the teacher said as Izuku was lining up his shot. He sank the tip of Wado into the ball, and cocked his arm back like a Major League Baseball player, and swung with one arm, sending the ball flying. Aizawa casually recorded it and displayed a score of 750 meters. This is the standard you all will be measured up against. If a quirkless can get a score like this, there's no reason that any of you should get anything less, Aizawa said, but earned a look of ire from Izuku, who then looked away from his teacher. He walked back to the students and brushed shoulders with Bakugo, who seemed to be absolutely seething. Bullshit. He yelled and grabbed Izuku by the neck of his shirt, and yanking him close. There's no way you're that strong without a quirk. You have to be lying, he yelled, and then Izuku gave him another one of his blank looks, like the many other times they have clashed. He didn't seem scared, even as Bakugo was about to blast his face off, at least until a white strip yanked on his arm. It belonged to their teacher, whose hair was now floating and eyes glowing a vibrant red. Quit your complaints, brat, he said, and Bakugo looked at his teacher, a lot of his rage now festering and under the surface, but he begrudgingly let go of Izuku. You chose to train your quirk, Izuku trained his body alone. We all have our ways of becoming stronger, and if you can't deal with someone outclassing you, then you might as well quit here and now. Aizawa said, you can thank your blonde friend here too, because I'll be kicking out the weakest among you after these tests, so whoever scores last will be expelled from 1A, and possibly UA itself. The class all tensed up at hearing this. You can't expel us, there has to be some regulations to this, Ochako said out loud, vocalizing what the rest of the class probably thought. UA is famed for the freedom it grants its students, right? Aizawa said neutrally. This freedom extends to us teachers, and we're allowed to run our classes how we see fit, he said to the round-faced girl. You're welcome to leave and give your spot to someone who isn't so weak-willed about things, Aizawa said. This sentence alone got all the other students rigid and at attention. They all realized that where they were, a school for heroes. Of course there would be some anomalies. The rest of the students soon began psyching themselves up, hoping to receive prominent scores. Montage time. Grip test, god damn it, kid, Aizawa said as he was looking at Izuku. Izuku seemed a little nervous as he held the grip tester, which now had 4 large indentations in it from when Izuku had crushed in his hand. Sorry, Aizawa-sensei, he said nervously, while a couple of the other kids just looked on, somewhat dumbfounded. Shoji's grip, while impressive, only got him second place. Side-to-side step Mineta was standing between his balls, bouncing quite aggressively. However, his pace was put to shame by the faster Izuku, who was even more of a blur than the grape-headed student was, just on sheer strength alone. He's certainly impressive, the ponytailed girl said, watching his performances. There's no way he doesn't have a quirk, just look at the pace he's going. Another boy yelled, this one with red, spiky hair and a mouth full of sharp teeth. No, he's definitely quirkless, Aizawa said, staring at Izuku. However, his hair was floating above his head to give him a more octopus-like appearance, and his eyes glowing red. He let it release after a few seconds. All his feats today aren't linked to a quirk. It's all pure strength and skill, Aizawa said. The students looked on in awe as Midoriya stopped his reps, body covered in sweat. Quirkless, just like him, All Might thought. He was watching the class through the bushes. He looked on at Izuku's performances, his mind wandering throughout it all. The same thought was running through the head of Aizawa. I wonder, will he become one of them? The bored-looking man thought. But they were thoughts for another day. For now, it was time to focus on the students. Later, after the test, all right, now that you've all completed the physical examinations, I'll be placing your scores up all at once. It's inconvenient to just call names one at a time, Aizawa said, and then he pressed a button, placing all the scores of the students on an electronic bulletin. The students all rushed up, to see where they were. But one thing was certain. Katsuki Bakugo was infuriated even further by the scores, and he looked back at the ever-calm-looking Izuku, standing there, because to the two of them, only 2 scores mattered. Izuku Midoriya Katsuki Bakugo, while the rest of the class fawned, or groaned, at the results of the examinations. The blonde and the green-haired boys focused intently on one another, one of them the calm before the storm, while the other was a raging typhoon. But the two never got to break their standoff, as Aizawa sent them to go to their next class. Before Izuku could go, the whole class swarmed him, shooting off multiple questions. You're really quirkless? How did you get so strong? What's with the swords? All these questions and more were bombarding Izuku as he was quickly growing flustered, a blush growing on his face as he rubbed the back of his head. Come on, guys. I can answer your questions later, he said to the other teens surrounding him. Muscled past the other students in a panic, and they all just watched. HMPH, our first quirkless students in years, Aizawa said under his breath. His mouth was curling up into a grin as he looked at them. Looks like this year will be pretty interesting. Musutafu train station, wait up, Midoriya-san. A young man yelled as Izuku was waiting for the train. He was caught by Iida, who was walking towards him along with Uraraka. Ah, Iida and Uraraka, it's good to see you again, he said pleasantly. You were amazing in the entrance exam, Deku-kun. I've never seen anybody practice swordplay before. The round-faced girl said, Iida. Nodding in agreement. Indeed, your performance was unique, and unlike anything I've ever seen before, Iida said. How did you at all without a quirk? He asked, but Izuku was instead focusing on Ochako, with a gaze that was calm, but nonetheless threatening. It unnerved the both of them. I'm sorry, Ochako-san. Deku is a name I'd prefer you didn't call me. The blonde Kachan calls me that to try and make fun of me, he requested, and Ochako blushed. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said, looking flustered. Is Midoriya okay? She asked, and Izuku nodded. She quickly lost her nervous look and smiled once more. Sorry to ignore you, Iida. Izuku said, I don't really have any secrets. I just work to earn my strength. I hope that my presence will inspire other quirkless to follow in my footsteps, he said as his train arrived. I'll see you two later, he said, and he stepped on. Iida and Ochako watched in awe as he seemingly disappeared into the crowd. The last thing they saw was the white hilt on his waist. School at UA was surprisingly normal. Barring the actual heroic courses, a majority of Izuku's time was spent in normal classes. Mathematics, sciences, even languages classes were all present, with a phys ed course being replaced by heroics application for 1A and 1B. Currently, Izuku was heading down to his first official heroics application class. Beforehand, it was all just theory and the basic rulings on what goes into the heroics career. Entering the classroom, he immediately took a seat away from Bakugo, the two having made a silent agreement to stay away from one another, neither wanting to ruin their standings in the class with needless fights, no matter how much they wanted to settle their conflict with one another. The class heard, a muffled but deep voice echoed. am entering the room like a normal person, the mighty. All Might bellowed as he burst through the door. He was dressed in one of his older costumes, a primarily red costume accented with white stripes. He also had yellow-finned gloves and a dark blue cape. He also wore a pair of blue pants and yellow boots as well. He did the opposite of a normal entrance, a majority of the class stated, slightly sweat dropping as All Might looked over the class, his eyes lingering on Izuku for a split second. Then he looked at the rest of the class proudly, striking his signature pose with his arms at his sides. Whoa! It really is All Might. I can't believe it, that's his old Silver Age costume. Heroics application. All Might yelled to get the attention of the class, pointing to them all. While it is true that you all have been studying what it means to be a hero, all of that curriculum is nothing if you can't put it into practice. Think of this class as the lab portion of a science class. The number one pro stated, and he held out a small plaque that displayed the word, battle, in a stylized red lettering. Today, we will be testing your strength on the battlefield. From what you had submitted on your student application forms, we have designed each of you a hero costume that best fits your quirk's strengths, and any style choices you had previously submitted. All Might stated, and sections of the walls slid out from the wall to reveal small lockers, each of them marked with a number corresponding to each student's assigned seat. All of you kids, go and change into your hero costumes. I'll meet you all out at Field Beta. All Might said, and with that all the students excitedly rushed off to change into their outfits. Field Beta. All Might was standing in front of the entrance to Field Beta, standing between two small podiums and looking at the mass of students approaching him. To say the least, he was quite impressed with the class before him. A majority of his students had come forth, proudly bearing their new uniforms for heroics, with the impressive ranging from Ida's armor, a tribute to the line of Ingenium, and the intimidating like Bakugo's more militaristic outfit, deep greens and vibrant oranges clashing like his own explosive quirk, a pair of grenade-shaped gauntlets making a clear indication of just what he could do. The costumes of the female students were all varying, and while some were more revealing than others, the entire class had the look of heroes. Sorry I'm late, All Might, another voice rang out, from that same hall ran forth Midoriya, his own approach to his costume being one of conservatism over flashiness. Izuku's heroic outfit was indeed quite bland. He wore a black pair of pants with matching boots as well as a plain beige long sleeve. Over this he wore a deep green robe that concealed his trio of swords, with his now trademark bandana tied around his wrist. His hair was done up into a high ponytail as to keep it from obstructing his vision. His outfit would remind many of Wandering Ronin. Wow, Izuku. You look really mature in that, said Ochako as she approached him. Her outfit could best be described as sexy astronaut. It was a primarily black and pink jumpsuit with puffy light pink boots and gloves, with a helmet to match, only slightly tinted as one could still see her face through it. I wish I had been more specific when I submitted my design. This feels so revealing, Ochako said. Her heroics outfit did cling to her skin, leaving little up to the imagination as to what was underneath her suit. Izuku on the other hand could only blush at the praise he was receiving. Thanks, Uraraka. I like your costume too, he said. His usual nervous persona was quite apparent, holding a hand behind his head. Izuku then looked around the space before them, looking for a particular student. Zero. He called out. The student in question turned to him. Zero's tape-themed quirk could be seen in his hero uniform, with an orange, black, and white color scheme with his helmet and shoulders designed to look like the teeth on a tape dispenser. Huh? Whatcha need, Izuku? He asked quite curiously. The two never really conversed before this, but were still on friendly terms. The green-haired hero wasted no time though, as he pulled lengths of tape from Zero's elbows, proceeding to bind the sheaths of his swords to their guards. Hey, what are you doing? Zero yelled out, looking both annoyed and confused under his helmet. Sorry to do this so suddenly, but I don't want to be tempted into unsheathing my swords. This is only practice after all, Izuku said, flustered. Zero calmed down after that, and silently let his classmate finish up with his preparations. Once he was done, the middle of each of his swords was wrapped in white, firmly denying any chance of the gleaming steel underneath to be revealed. All Might was polite enough to wait for a bit so everybody's attention could be on the lesson at hand. Today's hero lesson. Mock battles. All Might yelled out to the class and held out a box, and each student reached in to grab something. That something was a lettered ball. Izuku's ball was lettered A. Each of you have been assigned to two-man teams, determined by the ball you match with. All Might said. Students began to pair off. Izuku looked around, with each of the teams progressing and forming. As the teams were assembled, the girl with a red leotard with a utility belt of sorts. She gave a cordial bow to the green-haired swordsman. My name is Momo Yaoyorozu. Your initial scores were quite impressive. I look forwards to working with you on this team. Assignment. The girl said as she extended a hand. Izuku, ever the nervous wreck he is, reached out and shook the hand. All right, let's do our best, he said with a smile as the team compositions were put up onto a board. Team A. Momo Yaoyorozu, Izuku Midoriya. Team B. Toru Hagakure, Tsuyu Asui. Team C. Mina Ishido, Ejiru Kirishima. Team D. Katsuki Bakugo, Ochako Uraraka. Team E. Yuga Aoyama, Mashirao Ojiro. Team F. Mineta Minoru, Honta Siro. Team G. Kyoka Jiro, Fumikage Tokiyami. Team H. Denki Kaminari, Shoto Todoroki. Team I. Koji Koda, Rikido Sato. Team J. Tenya Iida, Mezzo Shoji. All right, it's time to decide the team matchups. All Might yelled as he reached into two boxes, shuffling around. Izuku's face was looking up at the board, attempting to formulate counters to all their opponents. All right, all these team compositions are somewhat balanced. If we get matched up against a team like H, closing in for melee will be key. He thought to himself, as long as we don't get. Team A will be playing the heroes, Team D will be the villains. The number 1 pro announced as he held up the balls for teams A and D. Izuku's face immediately dropped and sighed as the rest of the students began to file out to the viewing room. Team D will be allowed an extra 10 minutes in order to set up their base of operations. In the meantime, you heroes are allowed to strategize as well. I wish you both luck in this mission. All Might announced with a thumbs up. Team A was left to stand outside the small, multi-story building and the two quickly began deliberating. I will have to take the front. As useful as your quirk is Momo. Katsuki isn't going to give you any breathing room to use, because he'll be gunning for me. I'll leave it up to you to secure the bomb, he told Momo. Momo looked at Izuku now with a bit of unease. As strong as you are, Izuku, don't you think it's a little reckless to just charge in? There should be another way to enter the building, Momo suggested. Izuku's face broke into a small grin. I'm aware, which why I will draw attention from the front and bottom. I think you should enter from the rooftop or one of the windows. It will be unexpected, he said, and then the timer started. All right heroes. Your timer begins, now. Good luck to you all. All Might all but yelled into the earpieces of the 4 teens. Looks like we'll be starting. I'll go high, Momo said. Her skin began to produce a grappling hook and a launcher slowly, aiming for the roof as Izuku tied his green bandana to his head, his gaze hardening almost immediately. And I'll go low. Good hunting to you Momo, Izuku said as he then proceeded to enter the building by kicking the doors wide open. His stroll was calm, eyes half-lidded but attentive as he scanned his surroundings with all his senses. Suddenly he grasped his 2 burner swords and lashed out to his left as the wall blew open with the blonde bomber rushing through the debris with his hands out and smoking. Deku. Bakugo yelled out as Izuku was forced to skid back, his back arched forwards as he stopped himself from falling over or forwards. Their eyes met as Bakugo landed. Fierce and savage red clashed with the seemingly serene but primal green in their eyes as they held a stare with one another, each of them just itching for the other to move. TCH. Bakugo, Izuku said as her rolled his neck, his voice lowering an octave or two whenever he wore the bandana. It's time for us to answer the question of who's stronger, he said, to which Katsuki spat out. "There's no question to it, Deku," Bakugo said, almost snarled out as his hands began to spark. "I've always been the strongest," the blonde yelled as he ran forwards, "and now I'm gonna fucking show," was all Bakugo could get out before Izuku suddenly appeared in a blur in front of Bakugo, and one of the blades caught the blonde in the head and sent him slamming into the ground, before he was forced to roll away as Izuku was about to mercilessly stomp on him. "You talk too much, Bakugo," Izuku said as he looked at his opponent, with his favored sword clutched between his teeth, and Bakugo was looking up with a look of rage and defiance. "I'll kill you," Bakugo roared out in fury as he jumped up from his prone position on the floor, and then began to let off his blasts in close proximity with the swordsman, his hands sending off explosions towards the emerald-haired warrior. Observation room. The rest of Class 1A were all mouths agape as they watched two of the highest-ranking individuals were fighting with a savage intent. "It's almost like they're trying to kill each other," commented Denki, who seemed rather distressed by the situation as she watched the two lock into one another. Two of Izuku's swords locked into one of Bakugo's gauntlets, with the two even butting heads with each other, giving off savage scowls. These weren't some kids having a petty squabble or giving it their all. No. These were two beasts who wanted blood to be shed. The whole class seemed almost frightened by this sheer display of power. All Might. Such displays of blatant aggression and malicious intent are clearly too dangerous for such a simulation. "You have to stop this immediately," Iida commented as he was clearly concerned for the well-being of the others. But All Might's jaw was locked into a lock of both worry and intrigue. "I know that, young Iida," the #1 pro thought to himself, but this fight, it can serve to help both them not only grow physically, but grow past their own personal issues as well. "I must let it go forwards," All Might thought to himself as he then turned his attention to a separate screen. Uraraka was playing it off smart despite the lack of aid from her partner. She ised her anti-gravity quirk to float the bomb to the ceiling to keep it hidden, while she herself was also hiding so that any rooms explored would seem empty. She dully heard the fight going on far below her as the booms even echoed here near the top. She could feel her stomach getting queasy as the window to her room was suddenly shattered and Yaoruzu burst through, swinging in on her grappling hook. "Give up, Uraraka. This is a bad matchup for you," Momo said as she landed on the floor of the room, looking up at the floating hero and bomb. She aimed her grappling hook up towards the two, trying to find a clear shot. Uraraka, however, was using the walls at the top of the building to bounce around, although one could tell her face was turning green from nausea. Eventually, all the Zero-G hero in training could do was fall to the floor and attempt to block Momo from there. Before the two could engage in proper, however, a huge rumble could be felt below them. Then one of the walls collapsed upon itself, before its opposite was suddenly cleaved apart, and the building began to tumble down. All the girls could think was, "What are those guys doing?" Earlier on floor 1, the fight between Bakugo and Izuku was escalating. Their strikes were growing more deadly as both combatants were battered with bruises and burns covering them. Katsuki's face was twisted into a look of rage and annoyance as Izuku still held that calm and serious look this entire time. "Shitty Deku. Your fave has really started to piss me off. I can't believe I have to waste my secret weapon on a worthless shit like you," he said, pointing his hand forwards and holding onto a pin located in his gauntlet. "These gloves absorb my sweat, so now I can use this to throw my biggest possible blast at you. How do you like that?" he yelled with a smirk drawing upon his lips, but it quickly fell as his opponent showed little in the way of changing. In his earpiece, All Might was screaming at him. "Young Bakugo, don't. A blast of that magnitude and at this range could kill young Midoriya." "It's okay, All Might," was the answer the green-haired warrior gave as he held onto his swords differently. "If we're unleashing our best, I'd be happy to oblige," he said, and with the simple flick of his body, all three sheaths flew off their blades, revealing the gleaming silver. Time seemed to stand still for them, the entire class watching for what seemed to be an eternity, before Izuku moved forwards with a leap, and the blonde acted in return. "Die," was all that was uttered before the swordsman and the entire area behind him were engulfed in the blast. It seemed as if Bakugo truly followed up on his promise, until Izuku burst forth from the cloud of smoke. The entire upper half of his costume was blown away in the blast, and he now bore a large burn mark across his left chest and arm, but the look in his eyes was anything but pained, and for the second time in his life, Katsuki Bakugo truly felt fear. It's like looking at a demon, he thought to himself, and an hours of killing intent had appeared around the Green Warrior and had almost shaped itself. But there wasn't not enough time to make it out before steel met skin and the massive X-slash had appeared on Katsuki's chest, and the force had sent him flying back and slamming through multiple walls, and subsequently began the collapse of the building. Izuku seemed to stand there unflinching, but it would be quick to see that Izuku had simply fainted standing, his body rigged and refusing to fall. Almost immediately after snapping out of his stupor, All Might slammed a button on the control panel, and a horn blared throughout the area, declaring disqualification, and he rushed out, along with the rest of the class. Already school paramedics were on their way and had the boys on stretchers and were being pulled away, while the girls were surprisingly okay. Uraraka instinctively using her quirk to keep them from falling, although they did have some scratches. They seemed pretty spooked though, and while the class was in a commotion, seeing as one of the buildings had been destroyed, All Might on the other hand, seemed apprehensive as he had broken into a sweat. Those boys, he said to himself, seeing the destruction they caused. Just how strong are they, All Might? An old voice interrupted All Might's inner monologue with a feeling of dread as Recovery Girl approached, looking rather irate. As she walked to the number 1 pro. How could you let something like this happen? She yelled as she gestured to the currently resting Bakugo and Izuku, both of whom looked like they were in intensive care, with Bakugo's entire chest having been bandaged and wrapped, while the same was true for his left pectoral and part of his left arm. You're supposed to be a teacher, and yet you let your students almost kill each other? She yelled, while All Might rubbed the back of his head awkwardly. He didn't really have answer, all he could do was see as all the other students were crowded around the two, making a cacophony of noise as they drilled the obviously tired fighters with questions. What the hell was that? Do you two have a grudge or something? How the hell did you guys pull off moves like that? All these questions and more were being shot at before the elderly nurse had to chase them off, and that included pushing All Might out the door. Don't think we're done here, Toshinori, she said dangerously. As for the rest of you, head to class. Goodness knows what your teacher may do to you for skipping, she said, and looked to the sleeping children in their hospital gowns. If this is the trend of this year's batch, I'd hate to see what havoc they wreak, she thought to themselves, preparing their treatments. And scene. Hey Deku. The green-haired swordsman startled slightly from his injury-fueled sleep, only to sit up as the other resident of the nursing office called to him. What is it, Bakugo? He asked as her looked over, looking rather annoyed. Fuck you for putting us here. The blonde bomb announced, looking straight up at the ceiling. The two of them had not only received failing grades for the test, but they were to be bedridden overnight so Recovery Girl could keep an eye on their progress of healing. By now their bandages were off, and both sported some impressive battle scars. Bakugo's chest was now marked with a massive X scar across his chest, the scar tissue having become a lighter purplish-red color. Izuku on the other hand had burned scars going along his left pec and traveling up to his shoulder. He seemed to scowl at the blonde as they both then sat up, eyes locking in an intense stare down. You really think it's my fault? It's your damn fault for being so damn petty about being stronger, he said with annoyance and stood up. Today was their last day in the medical room, so they'd be returning to class. At the very least, cool your ego so we don't fuck each other up like this again. Any more damage than this, we might end our careers as heroes early, he said. If anyone else was there they would feel an incredibly thick atmosphere in the room as the two were still sizing one another up, before it all disappeared. Fine, just don't get in my way, Bakugo said as he then shoved past Izuku, although both winced as their new wounds were aggravated. The two left at different times as to not further antagonize the other, and when they arrived back at class, any non-academic topics having been held off. You two are late, Aizawa said as he then took out his notepad. Good for you to join us. It's time for your evaluations, he said, flipping to the first page. Bakugo, your needless provocation of Izuku got both of you grievously injured. Get your ego in check or get out, the shaggy-haired man said before turning slightly to Izuku. Izuku, you were also reckless and destroyed the building you fought in. If this were a real bomb situation, you would have killed us all. It goes without saying that you both failed resoundingly, he said, and the two of them didn't look too happy about the declaration. Now, because we have been busy with your physical examinations, it's finally time to choose your class reps. I don't care how you do it, just get it done, he said, zipping into his sleeping bag and proceeded to take a nap. Iida soon stood up, looking to his classmates. I propose that we all engage in a class vote to decide our representative, Tenya said as he stood in front of the class. Most of the classroom seemed somewhat reluctant. Is a class vote actually the best route? I mean, we don't even know each other very well, said Suyu as she looked to Tenya. That's exactly why we must choose this route. With our relative unfamiliarity, anyone who can gain the votes of others has to be qualified for the position, Tenya said, and proceeded to hand out slips of paper for people to write their votes on. When Tenya got to Izuku, however, he seemed to be napping, his head against the table as he had seemingly ignored Tenya's speech. Midoriya, how could you sleep through that? This is a very important event for the class, and for you to just sleep through it is incredibly uncouth, he yelled, constantly pointing at him. Izuku's response was to snore, as he had slept through his second rant as well. Iida sighed at this, deciding it easier to let sleeping dragons lie. The rest of the class engaged in the vote, each member throwing out a vote for who they wanted to be class rep, and the finished votes didn't really surprise anybody. Momo Yaoyorozu 3 votes, Iida Tenya 2 votes, almost all others 1 vote, Ochako Uraraka 0 votes, Shoto Todoroki 0 votes, Kyoka Jiro 0 votes. Izuku Midoriya 0 votes. The swing of the votes didn't really surprise anybody. Momo and Iida were both from prestigious and high-profile schools and excelled in such activities. And since Izuku had slept through the voting process, he couldn't even vote for himself. Momo came up to the front and gave a respectful bow to the class. I thank you all for the opportunity you have given me. I will lead you all to the best of my abilities. Her speech was short, but polite, and earned her a polite clap. Once the vote was over, the school bell rang for class and all the students left. Well, all except one. Lunch Rush Cafeteria. Wow. I can't believe the hero Lunch Rush is running the school cafeteria, Ochako said excitedly as she could see the hero behind the counter, whipping out dish after dish as students were ordering. Indeed, although it is a shame Midoriya is not present to enjoy it with us, Iida stated as he took a drink from the orange juice he had gotten with a salad. Where is he anyways? You would think a guy with that much muscle would eat like a truck, Kirishima said, food stuffed into his mouth. Class 1A homeroom. Why aren't you eating lunch? Aizawa asked as he saw that Izuku had come back to his homeroom. Didn't feel like eating. Rather just sleep, he said, and immediately he let his head drop to the desk and he could be heard snoring quite loudly. Smart kid, the insomniac said as he picked up his own sleeping bag, deciding to take a similar path. Guess we'll never know, Ochako said, but their relatively quiet lunch was interrupted by an alarm blaring, and most the students looked up, wondering what was going on, before a panic started and everybody began to run towards the entrance to the lunch hall. What's going on? It's a level 3 security breach. It means somebody has illegally gotten onto school campus, shouted Iida as the group of 1A students had been swept up by the tide of panicked children. Most of the students, who were actually from general ed and support courses, were all desperately trying to push and shove past each other to get into the hallway, where they became like a flood of bodies pushing through. This is insane. How could the students succumb to fear so easily? Iida thought to himself as he was trying to hold his group together, but could already feel them being pulled away from him. Looking to the front of the pack, he could see a figure casually walking in front of the stampede, much too casually. As they neared him, Iida's eyes widened as he feared for the student he could now recognize as Midoriya. He's going to be crushed. I have to. Warn, his thought pattern was interrupted, as he noticed the look on his face, one of pure annoyance and contempt as he stood before the tide. "All you guys really need to calm down," the green-haired student said in low, almost growling voice, gripping the hilt of one of his katanas. "You're annoying me." The boy yelled out as an aura almost seemed to extend off of him as the fearful student body all skidded to a halt as they were all stopped by a fear greater than the panic stirred by the alarm. They were stopped by the killing intent of this one student. Once they all stopped, Midoriya allowed his stance to relax a bit. Besides, that alarm was a bit of a dud. "It's just the news crews," Izuku said aloud as he decided to walk back into his homeroom. Iida, along with the rest of Class 1A, was completely dumbfounded by the raw display of power their classmate just performed, and immediately followed him back into the classroom. "Izuku. That was totally nuts, man," Denki yelled as a good portion of the class surrounded Midoriya, who was attempting to nap, his bandana covering his eyes. "How did you do that? It's like everyone was suddenly scared of you," Mina yelled as she got especially close, to which Midoriya lifted up a part of his bandana, exposing an eye, giving them a look that would have familiar on their teacher. "You're all way too loud. I'm just trying to sleep before the next period," he said with a slight yawn. Mina, along with most of 1A, decided to leave him alone after that, with the exception of Iida. "Midoriya-san," Iida said as he stood in front of his desk still, "I think you should be the president of Class 1A. He told the blinded Izuku. "Your act today halted everybody else's panic in an instant. Such a quality of leadership would be wasted anywhere but." "It wasn't leadership skills," Izuku said, only confusing Iida further. "What I did today was me instilling fear into everybody, raw fear of the powerful. Does somebody who leads through fear sound like a good leader, Iida-san?" He asked and leaned back into his chair to sleep once more, signaled by the fact he was snoring. Iida was left standing there, somewhat confused. "He doesn't want to lead. He has ked himself, outside campus." Aizawa, Toshinori in his deflated form, along with Nedzu were all standing in front of a large hole in the wall. "Do any of you think the media did this?" Toshinori asked. "No, they were likely used as a diversion to subvert our attention, and hide what their true intentions were," Aizawa said. "Most likely, this serves a twofold purpose. To allow whoever made this an entrance," Nedzu said, looking straight the large hole ominously. "And a declaration of war." The next day Izuku and the rest of 1A were all boarding buses, garbed in their hero costumes as they were off to their next hero lessons. "Rescue missions, huh?" Izuku said to himself as he was staring down at his equipment. "Is there even a way for me to use these to save people from disaster?" "Hey Izuku!" the red-headed man of 1A shouted as he gestured over to sit with him, along with the others who had located themselves amongst the center of the bus. "Come and sit with us over here," he shouted quite happily, to which Izuku decided had little else to do. Sitting down next to Kirishima as it seemed he would be thoroughly questioned by his peers. "So where did you learn how to do swordplay, Midoriya-san?" Tsuyu asked, looking at his two katana. One of them had a beautiful white sheath while the other two seemed to have more drab, black sheaths. "I learned from my master, a man who called himself Rorinoa," he said simply, and then grabbed the hilt of his most prized possession, and freed Wado Ichimonji from its sheath, allowing the rest of the class to look at the gleaming silver blade. The whole class awed at its beauty, others with intrigued while others didn't really seem to care. "He gifted me this blade. He was passed it from a friend he said had died in an accident, and now that his journey is complete, has passed it on to me so it can still see action. At least that is what he said," he said, and then sheathed it. "Did just training really get you all that physical force? There's no way you could get that strong without a quirk," Denki said, somewhat doubting of his classmate. To which he seemed about to answer. Until the bus stopped. "All right kids, we've arrived," Aizawa said as he ushered everybody off the bus. From the outside, the unforeseen simulation joint, or USJ, appeared to be a huge black concrete dome, physically big, but otherwise unimpressive. That fact changed when the class entered. the building and saw what it actually contained. It was almost like an amusement park with the scale, and contained a variety of rescue scenarios from wildfire to building collapse. UA spared no expense when it came to their training. Waiting for them at the entrance was what appeared to be an astronaut outfit with an outline of eyes within its black helmet. Welcome students to the USJ facility. I am the handler and teacher designated to run it, the rescue hero, 13, he announced quite happily. Where is All Might? He was supposed to be here, he said sternly, looking to his fellow teacher. Ah, All Might already called ahead. He had been caught up in hero work on the way here, and will unfortunately be late. The space hero said, the two sharing a more knowing look. Fine. All right everybody, we'll be separating into, Aizawa said before Denki pointed downwards towards the main plaza. Sensei, is that part of the simulation? He asked, before Aizawa and 13 turned around only to see a huge darkened purple cloud, with a myriad of savage and Vike-looking figures coming out. Chief among them was a lanky-looking man standing next to a much larger figure who had a bird-like face. No. Those are, Aizawa said, his voice wavering a bit as he was realizing what was going on. Villains! Shouted Midoriya, and it seemed that he already knew what he was going to do, as he leapt from the top of the stairs and directly towards the crowd of villains that was before him. Except as he was dropping towards them, their faces were going from a murderous glee to a dread-filled realization. The face bearing down on them wasn't an overeager hero cadet, this was the face of a monster. Blade Twister. Fang over Fang. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, spam red hearts in comment box.